There is a fundamental breaking point in the human psyche when it comes to the concept of gratitude. It is one thing to be hated by an enemy you are actively trying to kill. That is war. It is an entirely different, infinitely more toxic thing to be despised by the very people whose lives you have just saved. When someone looks at the hands that just pulled them out of a shallow, bloody grave and decides that those hands are somehow too dirty to break bread with, it creates a specific kind of silence in a room. Not the silence of respect, not the silence of fear. The heavy, suffocating, pressurized silence of absolute, unbelievable audacity. It is the kind of silence that demands a reckoning, because if it is allowed to stand, the entire moral architecture of the men in that room will collapse in on itself. For General George S. Patton, that reckoning arrived in a makeshift mess hall in the freezing, ruined landscape of Western Europe in the winter of 1944. It did not involve a captured Nazi. It did not involve a strategic blunder. It involved his own officers. White American officers who had just been pulled from the jaws of absolute annihilation by the 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black unit of Sherman tanks, and who, after the smoke had cleared and the blood had frozen in the mud, flatly refused to sit at the same table as the black men who had just bled to keep them alive. Type the word audacity in the comments right now if you can already feel the temperature dropping in that room, because what Patton did when he walked into that mess hall and saw that racial divide is one of the most blistering, uncompromising, and ruthlessly pragmatic moments of his entire life, and it is a story that the sanitized, polite versions of American history have spent 80 years trying to ignore. To understand the sheer, explosive gravity of what happened in that room, you cannot just look at the moment itself. You have to understand the deeply flawed, deeply prejudiced, and completely segregated machine that was the 1940s United States military. And you have to understand the specific, agonizing burden carried by the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, the men who called themselves the Black Panthers. During World War II, the United States was fighting a global war against a regime built entirely on the concept of racial supremacy, while simultaneously maintaining a rigidly segregated society and military of its own. According to the historical records preserved by the National Archives and detailed in Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's deeply researched historical account, Brothers in Arms, the official doctrine of the U.S. War Department at the beginning of the conflict was explicitly racist. The institutional belief, written into memos and spoken openly in the halls of the Pentagon, was that black men lacked the intelligence to operate heavy machinery, lacked the psychological fortitude for frontline combat, and lacked the innate courage to stand under fire. They were relegated to quartermaster companies, supply lines, grave-digging details, and driving trucks in the Red Ball Express. They were told, systematically and repeatedly, that they were not fit to fight for the country that they were wearing the uniform of. But the sheer grinding mathematics of the war in Europe began to force the Army's hand. You can only sustain so many casualties before necessity begins to override prejudice. The 761st Tank Battalion was formed as an experiment. They trained for over 2 years, far longer than most white units, because the Army kept refusing to deploy them. They trained at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, and Camp Hood, Texas, in the deep Jim Crow South, where they had to fight for the right to even exist on a base, where German prisoners of war were often treated with more respect and given better facilities than black American soldiers. They were forced to be perfect. They knew that if a white tank crew made a mistake, it was chalked up to the fog of war. If a black tank crew made a mistake, it would be used as institutional proof that their entire race was unfit for combat. They carried that psychological weight into the steel hulls of their Sherman tanks. They carried it across the Atlantic. And in the autumn of 1944, they carried it right into the orbit of General George S. Patton. Patton was not a progressive. He was not a civil rights pioneer. If you read his personal diaries, preserved in the Library of Congress and analyzed in Carlo d'Este's Patton, A Genius for War, Patton held many of the same racial prejudices that were common among wealthy, aristocratic white men of his era and his background. He was a man of the 19th century in his social views. He had privately expressed doubts about the combat effectiveness of black troops. But Patton had one obsession that overrode every single other thought in his head, every social norm, every prejudice, and every political consideration: killing the enemy. Patton did not care about the optics of segregation when he was losing tanks by the dozen. He cared about forward momentum. He cared about violence. He cared about winning. When the 761st was assigned to the Third Army, Patton stood in front of them in Nancy, France on November 2, 1944. According to Tres Van Anderson's 1945 book, Come Out Fighting, which remains one of the most vital primary source accounts of the battalion, Patton looked out at the sea of black faces standing at attention in the freezing cold and delivered a speech that stripped away the politics of Washington and reduced the war to its absolute, brutal essence. He told them, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Krauts." He told them that everyone had their eyes on them, that the Germans would call them the Black Panthers. And then he told them, "Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." The 761st did not let him down. They went into combat in November 1944, and they stayed in combat for 183 consecutive days. Let that number sink in. 183 days of uninterrupted, relentless, freezing, bloody armored warfare without relief. Standard military doctrine dictates that armored units need to be rotated out after a few weeks to prevent total psychological collapse. The 761st was never rotated out. They spearheaded the assaults for the 26th Infantry Division, the 71st Infantry Division, and the 17th Airborne. They fought through the mud of the Saar Basin. They fought through the freezing hell of the Battle of the Bulge. They cracked the Siegfried Line. They fought in M4 Sherman tanks, which the crews grimly referred to as Ronsons, because, like the cigarette lighter, they lit up the first time, every time, when hit by the high-velocity 88mm shells of the German Tiger and Panther tanks. The casualty rate was staggering. The men of the 761st watched their brothers burn to death in steel cages. They waded through snow that was stained red with American blood. And time again, they were the ones called in to rescue white infantry units that had been pinned down, outmaneuvered, and left for dead by the German counteroffensives. This brings us to the incident in question. It was the dead of winter. A white infantry unit, part of the larger divisions attached to Patton's Third Army, had been cut off and pinned down by heavily entrenched German forces. They were taking devastating casualties. They were out of options, freezing to death in their foxholes and waiting for an annihilation that felt mathematically certain. And then, tearing through the tree line, came the roaring, exhaust-belching engines of the 761st Tank Battalion. The Black Panthers did not hesitate. They drove their Shermans directly into the teeth of the German anti-tank fire. They laid down suppressing fire with their .50 caliber machine guns. They physically shielded the pinned-down white infantrymen with the holes of their tanks, absorbing the shrapnel and the explosive rounds that were meant for the men in the dirt. Black tank commanders popped their hatches, exposing the upper halves of their bodies to sniper fire, just so they could visually spot targets and guide the white infantry out of the kill zone. Black men died in that snow, so that white men could walk out of it. They broke the German lines. They saved the unit. It was the kind of transcendent, reckless, beautiful combat bravery that soldiers build monuments for. When the engagement was over, the surviving forces pulled back to a secured staging area to rest, to count their dead, and to eat. It was a makeshift mess facility in a ruined building, the kind of temporary sanctuary where the adrenaline finally leaves the body and the sheer physical exhaustion of surviving takes over. The mess cooks had prepared hot food, a rare and sacred luxury in the winter campaign. The men of the 761st, covered in grease, smelling of cordite and burned flesh, exhausted to the marrow of their bones, grabbed their mess kits and moved toward the tables. And that is when it happened. The white officers of the infantry unit, the very men who would be freezing corpses in a German forest if not for the black tankers standing in front of them, balked. They looked at the black soldiers. They looked at the tables. And they communicated, clearly and unmistakably, that they would not sit down and eat beside them. The Jim Crow conditioning of their civilian lives, the deeply ingrained arrogance of racial superiority, was so toxic and so deeply rooted that it survived the crucible of combat. They had accepted the blood of these black men. They had accepted their protection. They had hidden behind their steel. But they would not share a wooden table with them. Type the word disgust in the comments right now if you can feel the absolute stomach-turning sickness of that moment. Because it is one thing to read about historical racism in a textbook. It is another thing to place yourself in that freezing room, holding a tin tray, looking at a man whose life you just saved, and realizing that he still views you as a subhuman. The room went completely, terrifyingly quiet. The black soldiers of the 761st gripped their trays. The tension in the air was so thick you could have cut it with a bayonet. These were not the subservient, beaten-down men of the 1930s Deep South. These were combat veterans. These were killers. They had just driven tanks through Nazi fortifications. The impulse to drop the trays and resort to violence must have been overwhelming. The white enlisted men looked nervously at their officers. The mess hall hung on the edge of an absolute explosion. And then the doors opened. General George S. Patton walked into the room. He was doing his standard rounds, inspecting the frontline conditions of his units, driven by his usual manic need to see the faces of the men who were executing his operational orders. Patton, with his polished helmet, his riding crop, and his severe, hawkish face, took 2 steps into the room and stopped. He didn't need a briefing. Patton was a man who read the atmospheric pressure of a room the way a predator reads a tree line. He looked at the white officers clustered together, refusing to sit. He looked at the exhausted, soot-stained black tankers standing with their food. He looked at the empty spaces at the tables. He understood the geometry of the insult instantly. According to the oral histories passed down through the veterans of the Third Army and the historical accounts of how Patton managed his troops during the winter campaign, what happened next was a masterclass in psychological violence. Patton did not give a speech about civil rights. He did not give a speech about brotherhood or the brotherhood of man. That was not who he was. Patton operated on a totally different, infinitely more brutal wavelength. He operated on the wavelength of a combat god who demanded absolute devotion to the religion of warfare, and he had just walked into a room where his own officers were committing blasphemy against that religion. Patton walked slowly toward the white officers. The silence in the room deepened until it felt like it was going to shatter the glass in the windows. He didn't yell. When Patton yelled, it was usually for show. When Patton went quiet, it meant someone's career or their life was about to be destroyed. He looked at the ranking white officer. He looked him up and down with a gaze of such complete, unadulterated contempt that several men present later said they felt physically sick just watching it. He asked the officer, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried to the very back of the room, if there was a problem with the seating arrangements. The white officer, stammering, trapped between his ingrained social prejudices and the terrifying reality of standing in front of the commander of the Third Army, tried to mumble something about protocol, about the separation of units, about standard practices. He tried to hide his racism behind the bureaucratic language of the segregated army. Patton cut him off. He didn't argue the politics. He dismantled the man's right to exist in his army. Patton told him, in front of the black men who had saved him, in front of the enlisted men who relied on him, that the only color that mattered in the Third Army was the color of a man's blood. He pointed at the black soldiers of the 761st Street. He pointed at the grease on their uniforms and the exhaustion in their eyes. He told the white officers that those men had just driven through hell to pull them out of the fire. He told them that those black soldiers had proven that they were warriors, that they had the guts to kill the enemy and the guts to die for the men next to them. And then Patton delivered the killing blow. He looked at the white officers and told them that if they were too proud or too delicate or too superior to sit at a table and eat with the men who had just saved their miserable lives, then they were absolutely useless to him as combat leaders. Patton despised cowardice, but he despised ingratitude and weakness just as much. He told them that they didn't deserve to wear the uniform of the Third Army. He made it violently, unmistakably clear that in his theater of war, the men who fought and bled held the highest rank, and the men who hid behind their prejudices were nothing but dead weight. He didn't just order them to sit down. That would have been a matter of discipline. He humiliated them. He stripped them of their moral authority in front of their own men. He made them understand that in the hierarchy of the battlefield, the black men holding those metal trays were vastly superior to them, and that General George S. Patton, a man born to the Virginia aristocracy, a man with deep, documented prejudices of his own, had looked at the two groups of men and chosen the Black Panthers without a microsecond of hesitation. Patton then walked over, took a tray, and sat down at the table with the men of the 761st Tank Battalion. Type the word respect in the comments right now if you understand exactly what that gesture meant in 1944. Because you have to understand, Patton didn't do it to make a political statement for the newspapers back home. There were no reporters in that room. There were no cameras. He didn't do it because he was trying to be progressive. He did it because he recognized killers. He recognized warriors. And Patton worshipped at the altar of the warrior. He sat with them because in his eyes they had earned the right to sit with him, and the white officers standing nervously by the wall had not. The white officers, their pride shattered, their authority publicly dismantled, quietly and humiliatingly took their trays and sat down. They ate their food in the silence that Patton had created, a silence that was no longer built on their arrogance, but on their complete submission to the reality of the men sitting across from them. The 761st Tank Battalion went on to become one of the most highly decorated units of the Second World War. They liberated concentration camps. They drove all the way into Austria. They suffered a near 50% casualty rate. They earned 11 Silver Stars, 69 Bronze Stars, and about 300 Purple Hearts. But because of the deeply entrenched racism of the era, they were not awarded the Presidential Unit Citation until 1978, when President Jimmy Carter finally corrected the historical record. And it wasn't until 1997 that Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, a legendary tank commander in the 761st, who died holding off a massive German counterattack so his unit could escape, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. History has a way of smoothing out the rough edges of the people who make it. We like our heroes clean. We like our narratives simple. The mythology of World War II likes to present a unified American front, a greatest generation that marched arm in arm to defeat fascism. But the reality is that the men of the 761st Tank Battalion had to fight two wars simultaneously. They had to fight the Nazis in front of them, and they had to fight the crushing, dehumanizing prejudice of the country behind them. They were asked to die for a nation that would not let them eat at the same lunch counters, drink from the same water fountains, or sit in the same train cars when they got home. And the mythology of George Patton likes to present a man who was all bluster, all surface, all right-wing reactionary politics. But the truth of George Patton, the messy, complicated, undeniably compelling truth, is that when he stood in a ruined mess hall and was forced to choose between the social norms of his civilian upbringing and the blood-soaked reality of combat, he chose the blood. He chose the men who fought. He looked past the color of their skin and saw the only thing he truly cared about, their willingness to go into the dark and do the violence that the world required. That is what this story is really about. It is not a heartwarming story about racial reconciliation. It is a story about the brutal, uncompromising reality of merit in the face of death. It is about the fact that when everything else is stripped away, when the titles and the arrogance and the politics are burned to ash by the sheer heat of combat, all that is left is what you are willing to do for the man next to you. The white officers in that room forgot that. The black soldiers of the 761st never did. And Patton, for all his flaws, for all his contradictions, made absolutely sure that the men who forgot it would never be allowed to forget who reminded them. If this story hit you the way it hits me every time I dig back into the archives and read the accounts of what those black tank crews endured and what Patton did when he caught his own officers failing the most basic test of human decency, do one thing before you close this video. Hit the like button. Not for any metric, not for the algorithm. Hit it for the men of the 761st Tank Battalion. Hit it for the Black Panthers who drove into hell, saved the men who despised them, and changed the DNA of the American military forever. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep ripping the polite, sanitized covers off of history and looking at the raw, unfiltered truth underneath. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these deep dives. And leave your honest thoughts in the comments, because the conversation that happens there is the most valuable thing we do. I will be reading every single response. I will see you in the next one.